During his 2 years at Columbia University, Eisenhower had a mixed experience. He founded the Institute of War and Peace Studies to research the causes and consequences of armed conflict. Additionally, he established an informal council on foreign relations to deliberate on important foreign policy initiatives. These efforts provided Ike with rich opportunities for interaction with political, military, and intellectual leaders. However, Eisenhower faced challenges at Columbia. He found fewer opportunities to participate in educational policy formulation or to engage directly with students and faculty. Some members of the academic establishment looked down on him for his perceived lack of sophistication, exemplified by his preference for dime store Western novels. His limited involvement in the daily educational life of the university also led to some resentment. In 1950, he resigned from Columbia and returned to Europe to serve as the Supreme Commander of NATO. As Supreme Commander, Eisenhower spent a year advising America's European allies and helping to build a strong military coalition to stand against the rising forces of communism, defend democracies, and discourage future wars. Upon returning to the U.S. in 1951, he made a compelling appeal to Congress, securing firm support for NATO. Despite never having publicly aired any political opinions, Eisenhower's popularity led to a draft Eisenhower movement in the Republican Party. President Truman, who had offered support for Eisenhower's candidacy as a Democrat, was rebuffed when Eisenhower declared himself a Republican, leading to a permanent and bitter rift between the two. Eisenhower's decision to run for president was driven by concerns that his opponent for the Republican nomination, Robert A. Taft, was more focused on domestic policy and less on international security. Eisenhower's campaign was notably populist, with the catchy "I like Ike" slogan resonating with voters. He won the 1952 presidential election in a landslide against Democratic candidate Adlai Stevenson, capturing all but the southern states in the Electoral College and 55% of the popular vote. He repeated this success in the 1956 election, again defeating Stevenson with an even larger margin. As one of the oldest presidents elected in many decades, Eisenhower remained active, committed, and hardworking. He continued his hobbies, including reading, poker, bridge, attending sports events, and painting landscapes. Eisenhower's presidency featured massive economic growth, social change, and increasing international tension. While he prioritized foreign policy, his reticence to encroach on constitutional conventions and separation of powers has been seen by some as a lack of concern for serious social issues, particularly civil rights. Despite this, he implemented the desegregation of Washington, D.C., the armed forces, and the Foreign Service, and encouraged the recruitment of African Americans in government positions. However, his refusal to publicly condemn racist violence, like the murder of Emmett Till or the bombing of Dr. Martin Luther King's house, disappointed many civil rights leaders. Eisenhower's administration faced criticism for continuing Native American assimilation policies, which threatened their culture and way of life. Additionally, his failure to condemn Senator Joseph McCarthy's unconstitutional attacks during the Red Scare, which also targeted civil rights activists and the gay and lesbian community, was a notable shortcoming. Eisenhower loathed McCarthy personally, but only acted when McCarthy attempted to subpoena White House staff, invoking and defining the principle of executive privilege. Despite these controversies, Eisenhower's presidency is often praised for overseeing one of the largest economic expansions in American history, leading to unprecedented economic growth and improvements in the quality of life for many Americans. The automobile, construction, retail, and service industries flourished. Unemployment reached historic lows, and consumerism boomed. American productivity and job creation owed much to World War II. Industries continued to benefit from infrastructure built during the war, such as the automobile industry. Democratic Party members claimed that their New Deal programs and the GI Bill, which Ike had no hand in, were key factors in America's healthy post-war economy. There is truth in these claims. Ike did not pioneer the farming subsidy programs, the Social Security Administration, or the infrastructure to promote fair labor practices. He was not responsible for the GI Bill, which helped former soldiers and their families reach the economic equilibrium necessary to participate in the booming economy. However, Eisenhower did work to help facilitate the economic expansion in multiple ways. He disentangled private industries from government finances, many of which had become accustomed to receiving hefty government paychecks during the war for producing whatever was needed for the war effort. He also allowed tax rates for top earners, capital gains, and the wealthiest estates to remain high, a decidedly unconservative decision which brought him into conflict with members of his own party. A surplus of tax revenue allowed him to expand Social Security programs to benefit an additional 10 million American workers, providing them with access to unemployment insurance and pensions. Ike had never been the New Deal's biggest fan, particularly in his younger years. In fact, it was his exposure to Roosevelt's administration in Washington during the 1930s which hardened his largely conservative outlook. But by the 1950s, he was under no illusions about the benefits of the basic social welfare state. Any political party who tried to get rid of the New Deal programs now, he said, would never be heard from again. He described those who still aimed to deconstruct the New Deal as a negligible and stupid splinter group. Finally, one of Eisenhower's most significant contributions to America's economic expansion was his pioneering of the Interstate Highway Act of 1956. Originally envisioned as a quick evacuation solution from densely populated urban areas in the event of a nuclear attack, the creation of the nationwide highway system opened up national markets for trade and shipping, put small towns on the map allowing them to grow, encouraged interstate leisure travel, and facilitated the creation of businesses to serve all highway travelers. Eisenhower's America enjoyed the world's highest standard of living during the 1950s. When it came to foreign policy, Ike faced the daunting task of representing America on the world stage at the dawn of the nuclear era. His perspectives on both communism and nuclear weapons had evolved since the end of World War II. Ike had been in Russia when the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. He had been horrified, believing it had done more harm than good. The Japanese, he thought, had been close enough to surrender to make the use of the atomic bomb unnecessary, although some historians continue to disagree on this point. He found it repugnant that the United States had been the first to use nuclear weapons. He was also of the opinion that the atomic bomb had done more than anything to make the Soviets distrust the Americans, leading to increasing tensions in the years ahead. Eisenhower was still hopeful during the immediate post-war period, believing that Russia wanted friendship more than competition with the United States. By 1948, however, the Russians had tested their first atomic bomb, and tensions over Germany's economic recovery and Greece's civil war had risen considerably. The Soviets seemed bent on expansion, and Ike's stance on communism therefore hardened. He began to believe, as his Republican contemporaries did, that an overall policy of containment backed by the threat of military action or nuclear strike was the best path to secure American interests and continued world peace. Impressions of Eisenhower's handling of the Cold War continue to vary. Modern critics mostly condemn the activities of the CIA, which Eisenhower approved during his administration, including the overthrow of elected governments in Iran and Guatemala, charging that these operations had less to do with containing communism than installing governments more friendly to U.S. economic interests. These actions made Iranian oil accessible to U.S. and British companies and prevented the nationalization and equitable distribution of land among Guatemalans to facilitate the dominance of large-scale, corporate, American agricultural interests in the region. Containment of communism in Latin America and the Middle East continued to be a feature of American foreign policy in the years to come. The Eisenhower Doctrine, which offered military support to Middle Eastern countries determined to resist Soviet communism, profoundly affected the stability and geopolitics of the Middle East region during Eisenhower's presidency. He was praised for his contribution to solving the Suez Crisis in Egypt, but overall American policy in the Middle East has frequently been criticized for being at cross purposes with Arab countries, who viewed Zionist imperialism as a far greater threat than communism and who deeply resented American and British support for Israel. In principle, Eisenhower was more in favor of liberating communist countries than in containing them, but he understood that one could not constantly go to war in this new age of warfare. This is evident in his handling of the Korean War, his subsequent strategy of nuclear brinkmanship with Communist China, and his policy in Southeast Asia. The death of Stalin greatly facilitated the resolution of the Korean War, as it left a temporary power vacuum which rendered China more vulnerable to U.S. military threats, which Eisenhower did not hesitate to employ to force China to withdraw from the Korean Peninsula. Subsequently, Eisenhower was instrumental in formulating the U.S. policy of support for Taiwan against encroachments by Red China. Unwilling to commit more than funding and military advisors to the defense of French Indochina, later South Vietnam, Eisenhower's initially minimal commitment to defeating communism in Vietnam would eventually snowball under the subsequent Kennedy and Johnson administrations into an arduous and undeclared war that would take the lives of 50,000 Americans and millions of Vietnamese troops and civilians. Kennedy also inherited the task of executing the Bay of Pigs invasion, planned by the Eisenhower administration, which spiraled into the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Because Ike's foreign policy discouraged the pursuit of all-out war, his strategy for dealing with the expansion of Soviet influence and nuclear capability involved intricate negotiation and the building and maintenance of America's own nuclear arsenal and capabilities. Admirers of Eisenhower praise his efforts at nuclear disarmament, however unsuccessful they may have proven to be. When the Soviets exploded their first hydrogen bomb, Eisenhower went against the advice of his cabinet to propose mutual nuclear disarmament with the Soviets. The campaign was called Atoms for Peace and suggested that the two superpowers might agree to decommission their weapons, using them instead to create nuclear power plants for the benefit of both countries. Ike consistently tried to avoid the one-upmanship of the arms race with the Soviets, but also did not hesitate to enlarge the U.S. nuclear stockpile as the Russian arsenal increased. Eisenhower's open skies policy and proposed mutual inspections were also met with Russian refusal. Ultimately, neither side was willing to be the first to establish real trust by disarming first, or by being the first to permit UN-supervised nuclear inspections. The Eisenhower administration was significantly embarrassed by the U-2 incident when they approved one last illegal and covert surveillance flight of the Soviet Union prior to a summit with the Russians. Khrushchev promptly produced the pilot, Francis Gary Powers, whose plane had been shot down over Soviet airspace, and who confirmed that Eisenhower had lied when he denied the existence of the U-2 flight. Furious at Ike's unabashed refusal to apologize for the incident, Khrushchev promptly canceled the summit and rescinded Eisenhower's invitation to visit the Soviet Union. Throughout his presidency, Eisenhower grew to resent the absurdly high price tag for America's foreign policy. He had massively defunded America's conventional military forces and poured money into the development of a nuclear strategy which paradoxically kept Americans safe, using the principle of assured mutual destruction. The space race eventually came to seem excessive to him as well, and Ike referred to any administration that could spend $40 billion on a race to the moon as nuts. Ike reached the end of his presidency concerned above all about what he referred to as the military-industrial complex and its potential to hijack and erode American democracy. He had tried hard to end the excessive allocation of government and military funding to private companies after World War II, but in the thick of the arms race with the Soviets, he had not been able to prevent weapons manufacturers, who grew more powerful every year, from claiming an increasingly enormous share of American tax money for the weapons they produced. When his presidency was over, Eisenhower handed the reins of government to Kennedy, who had emerged victorious against Richard Nixon, Eisenhower's vice president, in the 1960 election. Accompanied by Secret Service detail, Ike and Mamie departed the White House for their farm in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Ike's retirement was both pleasant and fairly active. It meant much more time with Mamie, their son John, and their grandchildren. He wrote 3 more memoirs between 1963 and 1967 and continued his hobbies and pursuits, including poker, bridge, landscape painting, and a rather newer hobby for him, golfing. He also continued his support for Republican electoral candidates in his retirement. Eisenhower's health had begun failing as early as 1955, when he had his first heart attack, although Vice President Nixon and Eisenhower's cabinet had done everything possible to minimize the president's health problems to the media. Ike suffered no less than 4 more heart attacks over the next 10 years, the last of which left him fairly debilitated, and he was permanently hospitalized by 1968. Dwight Eisenhower died of heart failure on the 28th of March 1969 at the age of 78. His coffin lay in state in the rotunda of Washington's Capitol building for several days before he was laid to rest in his beloved hometown of Abilene, Kansas, in the grounds of the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum. He is buried next to his wife, Mamie, and their beloved first son, Icky. Like most other globally prominent figures of the 20th century, probably the most turbulent century of the modern period, Eisenhower has a complicated and frequently debated legacy. As one of the greatest heroes among the Allies in the Second World War, Eisenhower's contributions to victory give him indisputable historical importance and place him shoulder to shoulder with the Allies' greatest generals like Montgomery and Patton, and alongside political leaders like Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin, and de Gaulle, in terms of his influence. It is therefore interesting that while biographies on Eisenhower began to appear almost immediately following the end of World War II, and many more have been published in the decades since, Ike is in fact a great deal less visible in popular culture, iconography, and historical biography compared to these other prominent personages. Historians documenting his political record during the 1960s and immediately following his death were fairly critical of his presidency, particularly his silence or relative inaction on civil rights issues, or what they perceived as his limited success in preventing escalation of the Cold War. By the late 1970s and 80s, however, the conservative tide of politics had risen once again in the West, and new perspectives were offered by historians seeking to rehabilitate Eisenhower's reputation from the criticisms of earlier historians. Many of these more conservative historians attributed greater political skill to Eisenhower than he had previously been credited with. Eisenhower post-revisionists agree with this assessment, but criticize his performance as a political party leader, accusing him of failing to cultivate unity within the Republican Party or to sufficiently support Nixon in the 1960 election against Democratic candidate John F. Kennedy. This seesaw of historical perspectives continues, yet Eisenhower consistently continues to rank among the top 10 best U.S. presidents across multiple polling sources. His greatest admirers continue to tout his presidency as a period of exceptional economic and infrastructural development, and affirm that with Ike at the tiller, the NATO alliance held, communism remained fairly well contained, and the Cold War remained cold. Some go as far as crediting Eisenhower with the prevention of a Third World War. Deeper research and examination of this fascinating man is certainly called for. Although many commentators have judged his politics as significantly right-wing, Ike himself claimed to represent, in his own words, a political philosophy of progressive conservatism. Want to dive deeper into America's leadership? Click now to watch our next video on John F. Kennedy's extraordinary journey from war hero to one of the most iconic presidents in history. Don't miss the untold stories that shaped his legacy.